I have truly enjoyed working with in the last two sessions of the Congress. I want to thank all of you. As somebody who has been a credit union member for a long time, you know, when my wife and I got out of college, one of the first things we did was open an account with the credit union. She's a member, I'm a member, our campaign has used credit unions, and from the time I was on the Albuquerque City Council all the way through the last two terms, I've seen the impact that all of you have, in particular on small businesses at a time when credit has been so constrained in this country. So I want to thank you for what you're doing to get our economy back on its feet. I want to thank you for your focus on small business and your members, because it's made enormous differences to people I know in this community in a very challenging economic environment. And I want to say I hope I can continue to earn your support, and I certainly look forward to working with you long into the future.
Last questions for the Congressman?
Sure.
So you may be familiar with the Dodd-Frank Act, which I know its intent was to try to resolve some of the problems that caused us to get into this current economic mess. And in trying to resolve such a huge and unwieldy set of markets, it can be very complicated and very difficult. But if I look at the result of where we're at now, for the most part, really big banks are getting bigger. And there's an awful lot of small banks and credit unions that are going away for a number of reasons, including the regulatory burden keeps getting harder and harder to deal with. And we have one compliance officer, but there are people who are much smaller than us, don't have the opportunities to hire people to deal with that. Are you happy with the Dodd-Frank Act, and is there anything that you'd like to tweak, change, or are there things that you can do to help minimize regulatory burden with some credit unions that really didn't cause the problem in the first place?
Well, first off, I'll say, you know, credit unions didn't cause the problem, and I was of the minority opinion that we shouldn't hold them to the same standards as the big banks, because there was how we got into this mess in the first place. And I think that generally that has been my approach across the board. If you look at the issue of redlining, there's no reason to go after credit unions because there's not a problem there, and that hasn't always been true of the large national banks. Once again, if you look at the issue of swipe fees, I have had real issues with how Dodd-Frank has handled that, not because of its impact on Citibank, but because of its impact on community banks and credit unions. And so I'm very open to changes to Dodd-Frank that will lead to less over-regulation of the players, particularly in the community banks and the credit unions, who didn't get us here in the first place, and to try to bifurcate and set a different bar where if there is necessary regulation, that it's applying to the places where the problems were created in the first place.
Thank you.
Any comments on the current administration's release of what its budget looked like? The deficit continued to, I know we said this together, the deficit gets so much attention in the newspaper.
Sure.
What do you do? I mean, all of a sudden you just stop it, or?
I'll share some thoughts on how, if you look back, this deficit did not happen overnight. If you look back to 1998, we weren't in this position, and there were a number of individual decisions along the way that put us in the fiscal situation that we're in today. They were spending decisions and they were tax decisions. And so if you look historically at what led to the balanced budget in the late 90s, it was we were taking in about 19% of GDP in revenue. We were spending about 19% in programs. And if you fast forward to today, we're only taking in 15% of GDP and we're spending 25. I mean, it doesn't take a math whiz to realize that that's not sustainable. But what people don't want to talk about is to make that math work, to get both those numbers back to where they need to be requires actions on both sides of the ledger. It does mean that you have to go back to some of the revenue rates that were in existence in the late 90s, and you have to go back to the spending patterns in the late 90s. There were a number of individual large-scale decisions along the way that created the fact that we have a spending rate that's more like 25% of GDP today. On the revenue side, the tax cuts that happened in the early part of the previous decade are what moved that from 19 down to 15. On the spending side, it was things like, getting rid of pay-go rules. When they passed Medicare Part D, it's a great program, but there was no effort to actually pay for it when it passed. So that has spun out over time and continues to add to the deficit. You look at both the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Those were things that were done without thought to how we're going to pay for it. And historically, there have been efforts to get us as a nation to pay for things when we go to war. To say we've got to all pull together. This is so important to our national security that we're going to have to make some sacrifices for it. So you have to start unwinding some of those things. Some of them will be harder than others. Medicare Part D, I don't see how you make it go away because it is so central now to so many seniors, particularly in New Mexico. But you got to figure out a way to pay for it. You can undo what the Bush tax breaks that happened, and probably need to have a thoughtful look at how our entire tax system works today, particularly on the corporate side, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Small corporations tend to get taxed at a much higher rate, close to that 35% rate. Large corporations tend to get taxed in the single digits. And we all know it's the small businesses and small corporations that have the most capacity to hire in the midst of the economic challenges we're in today. So you've got to start piece by piece unwinding some of the mistakes of the past.
Thank
You bet.
As you know, though, there's a migration of bank customers to credit unions for reasons, most of which is Frank Dodd, the Durbin Amendment, specifically the Frank Dodd, that has restricted fees for banks. You hear a lot of negative press about how they're trying to restructure their fees to recoup some of this money, and which is driving even more people away. And it's not a matter of seeing them go away as it is that they're going to credit unions, because we're not going to charge those fees. But that means that if you're elected, you're going to come, and the other 99 senators are also going to come under probably an intense scrutiny and pressure from the banking industry to tax credit unions that we've never seen before. Now, you've already answered the question about the tax exempt status, and we appreciate your stand on that. But as somebody recently pointed out, things change.
Right.
We fully expect there to be an effort on the bank's part to so-called even the playing field by taxing credit unions, although taxing credit unions won't mean a penny's worth of difference to their business model. Right. So how are you going to handle the pressure?
The same way I've handled it for the past 3 years when I get lobbied each and every year about why it's a bad idea for me to be on the member business lending bill or other bills that are important to credit unions. And every year I get that pressure, and I get it to some degree from the community banks, but much more so from the big guys and the national guys. And it's pretty easy to look those folks in the face and say, look, when I go home, these are the people who are actually lending to the businesses in my neighborhood. And that's why I am where I am, because they're meeting a need that you're not meeting in my community. And until you can show that you care about a local community, and maybe it's part of your business model to actually lend to small businesses in central New Mexico, for me, this is what makes sense for my constituents. And that's what I've said time and time again when I get lobbied on the business caps, for example.
Okay.